They survived the cannon fire, the starvation, the months rotting in the notorious Confederate hellholes of Andersonville and Cahaba, only to drown in the shallowest, muddiest part of the Mississippi River, vaporized by the boiler explosion of a rotting wooden steamship named the Sultana. Think about that tax on the human spirit. They endured the unthinkable, secured their ticket home, crossed the finish line of the American Civil War, the bloodiest conflict in our history, and were then betrayed by the very machine built to celebrate their return. This isn't just a tale of mechanical failure. This is a story about the deliberate, ugly calculus of human fatigue, greed, and the national willingness to forget the wrong kind of tragedy. We are programmed to remember glorious battles. We are terrified of remembering pointless suffering. This is why you likely have never heard of the worst maritime disaster in American history. It cost nearly 1,800 lives, and America collectively shrugged, turning the page as if nothing happened. That shrug is the deeper catastrophe. Here is the reality. These weren't whole soldiers climbing aboard the Sultana on that freezing night in late April 1860, they were ghosts. They were walking skeletons, suffering from dysentery, scurvy, and the profound trauma of dehumanization. Many couldn't walk up the gangplank without assistance. They were prisoners, released into a system that saw them not as heroes, but as cargo. Expensive cargo, yes, but disposable nonetheless. The official capacity of the Sultana was 376 passengers. 4 massive, stressed boilers powered this aging leviathan. When the ship left Vicksburg, it carried well over 2,200 people, 6 times the limit. The decks groaned, the structure warped. This wasn't an accident. This was an assassination disguised as commerce. Always greed, always the dollar sign scribbled over human life. The man in charge, Captain J. Cass Mason, was paid a bounty, the going rate for transporting Union soldiers back north. He didn't care about their capacity for suffering or the integrity of his vessel. He saw only the head count. He saw money. He had packed those former captives in every possible space, crammed into the hold, stacked on the decks, even sleeping on the massive wooden wheel boxes. They were so dense that when the boilers finally gave out, when the initial explosion ripped through the sleeping ship at 2 a.m. near Memphis, the resulting chaos wasn't just a rush to the rails. It was a physics problem, bodies obstructing every avenue of escape, men being instantly cooked by superheated steam or forced into the frigid, fast-moving current of the flooded Mississippi. Most people prefer the neat chapters of history. War, victory, peace. They skip the footnotes where the real cost is tallied, where the mundane corruption causes catastrophic loss. If you, like me, believe that the deepest truths reside in those forgotten footnotes, in the failures they tried to bury, then you belong right here. Now look at the timeline. Lincoln had just been assassinated 2 weeks prior. The nation was already saturated with grief, already exhausted by 4 years of butchery. They had used up all their capacity for public mourning. When the news of the Sultana explosion broke, a massacre by indifference, the national psyche had nothing left to give. They had no tears left to cry for 1,800 men who had technically survived the war. We look back and call it bad luck. I call it a failure of moral accounting. The tragedy of the Sultana is not that it happened, but that it was instantly and systematically silenced by noise. The ongoing capture of Jefferson Davis, the grand review of the victorious armies, the funeral processions. The Sultana sank into the river, and its memory sank into the American consciousness, weighted down by indifference. That is the true tax on the soul. To suffer and die only to be deemed inconvenient by the survivors. But the sinking ship was just the beginning of the nightmare. The real horror unfolded in the water. The Mississippi was unnaturally high due to spring floods, rushing 3 to 10 miles per hour, carrying massive freezing debris, logs, trees, broken fences. The men who didn't die instantly of steam exposure had to fight hypothermia and the sheer kinetic force of the river. Most of them were too weak, too ravaged by prison life to swim 5 feet, let alone fight the river. Imagine the realization, surviving 4 years of battle, only to freeze and drown within sight of safety, betrayed not by an enemy cannon, but by bureaucratic greed. This disaster exposed the raw, unforgiving truth of Reconstruction America. The system that saved them was also the one that killed them, and nobody was truly held accountable. Nobody wanted to dirty their hands with this ugly final piece of business. They wanted closure. The Sultana offered only an open wound. The system didn't just fail these men. The system cannibalized them for profit and then deliberately scrubbed the ledger clean. Stop calling it human error. That cheapens the death toll. The problem wasn't the river, wasn't fate, wasn't even the tired steel of the boat. The problem was an obscene administrative failure, a chain of command, lubricated by pure, simple greed. The government was paying $5 to $10 per man transported back north. Captain J. Cass Mason, the owner, saw not veterans, but walking dollar signs. He packed the Sultana, designed for maybe 376 passengers and crew, with anywhere between 1,200 and 2,400 exhausted, sick, skeletal men. This wasn't overcrowding. It was criminal overloading, a deliberate sacrifice of safety for immediate taxpayer-funded wealth. That is the reality. That is the moment the moral collapse became physical. Now look at the catalyst, the boilers. The Sultana's boilers were already shot, leaking badly in Vicksburg. The standard protocol was mandated replacement, a costly, time-consuming procedure. Did they do it? No. Time was money. They found a tinsmith, someone who could patch the crack with an emergency repair, a simple iron plate held by screws, a patch job on the heart of a pressure cooker packed with 2,000 living souls. This shoddy, temporary fix, done in haste and concealment, guaranteed the inferno. It was a ticking clock built by accountants. It took only a few days of sailing, the heat, the constant, shifting weight of human cargo, the inevitable pressure surge, before the iron plate tore away, unleashing the destructive power of 4 massive boilers simultaneously. Think about that violence. The sound alone must have ended men's minds before the steam ended their lives. The blast wasn't a freak accident. It was a guaranteed, predictable detonation, ordered by bureaucratic indifference. They paid for a cheap fix, and they got a mass grave. The official investigations that followed were a farce designed by the victors. They weren't seeking truth. They were seeking convenient silence. The Army Board of Inquiry, the inevitable rubber-stamping mechanism of institutional failure, pinned the blame on a dead scapegoat, the chief engineer, a man named Nathan Wintrinter, who had supposedly neglected his duty. Dead men tell no tales, and dead engineers are perfect for absorbing systemic blame. But the men who authorized the overcrowding, the officers who ignored the manifest, who looked the other way for a quick bribe or an easier quota, they walked free. They were shuffled into new posts, promoted, or quietly retired. The system protects its own, always. You there, listening to this history they swept under the rug, don't pretend you haven't seen this pattern repeated 1,000 times since. This is the reality nobody taught you in school. because it complicates the narrative of a clean, heroic victory. If you value this kind of uncomfortable truth over comforting fiction, if you crave the mechanism behind the official story, then perhaps you belong in this space. We don't deal in historical comfort here. Pior enda, the initial cover-up extended beyond the official reports. The steamboat industry itself engaged in a highly organized disinformation campaign. They needed to protect the reputation of river travel, the lucrative engine of commerce that moved the post-war economy. If the public knew how rotten the inspection and maintenance protocols truly were, if they understood that the riverboats were floating bombs managed by cynical profiteers, the whole market might collapse. So they flooded the papers with stories about the weather, about freak mechanical failures, anything to dilute the one true narrative, that it was corporate crime. This sophisticated obfuscation worked. It buried the voices of 100 or 800 men beneath a mountain of commercially convenient lies. We look back and remember the Titanic, where hundreds died. We forget the Sultana, where thousands died, because the men in power made sure the silence was profitable. This is the cost of forgetting. It empowers the next generation of profiteers. It tells them the consequences are manageable. The truth is erasable. And the American mind, desperate for peace, proved all too willing to accept the erasure. The tragedy of the Sultana is a masterclass in how institutional accountability is dismantled, brick by historical brick, until only the ghost remains. They sacrificed history for capital. That is the only honest definition of the Sultana cover-up. It wasn't just a forgetting. It was an enforced national amnesia, a political tool wielded to keep the public calm and the rivers profitable. They needed the economy rolling. They needed faith in grand infrastructural projects. Who cares about a few thousand dead Union soldiers, men already brutalized by war and captivity? Just numbers, quiet numbers. The Sultana became the perfect operational test case. How much death can the public swallow before demanding true revolutionary justice? The answer, devastatingly simple, was everything. They swallowed the crime, the lies, and the shame whole. And they were told to move on. This structural indifference became the norm. This is the rot at the core of accountability. You think the system learned anything? Forget it. Now, look closer at the mechanism, the one they deployed in 1865 and the one still running today. The regulations, clumsy and underfunded, were technically there. The failure wasn't the law. The failure was the deliberate systemic refusal to enforce it, creating a culture where violating safety protocols was the smart business choice, the pathway to faster riches, and where the inspectors became complicit partners in the crime, trading real oversight for quiet compliance. That is how the system breaks. That is the template. When fines are paid out of future profits, they are no longer punishment. They are merely a predictable cost of doing business. The executives are never jailed. They rarely even apologize. They are simply moved to a different division, or they retire early with a golden parachute thick enough to choke a horse. We were trained by the Sultana to accept this grotesque calculus. We were conditioned to believe that bureaucracy is a shield protecting the powerful, not a safeguard protecting us. We accepted the lie that a disaster of this scale is merely a fluke, an outlier, a freak accident, rather than the inevitable consequence of normalized corporate psychopathy. It's not history repeating itself. It's history that never stopped. Think about the modern iterations, the financial collapses where no senior banker went to jail, The environmental catastrophes where massive settlements erase the criminal liability. The pharmaceutical scandals where profits outweigh human life. The script remains identical. The cast just changes their three-piece suits. And why wouldn't the powerful continue this charade? The Sultana proved that erasing the truth is remarkably cheap. The government gets to avoid admitting its regulatory failure. The industry gets to continue its predatory practices. The public gets the dubious comfort of a cleaned-up, simplified narrative. Everyone wins, except the dead. They lose their memory. I sincerely doubt that the current generation of corporate operators has ever even heard the name Sultana. They don't need to. They inherited the operating manual. They inherited the lesson that the official record is a negotiable document, easily burned, easily forgotten. This profound American amnesia, this inability to connect past negligence with present danger, is not some benign collective forgetfulness. It is the direct, poisonous fruit of that 1865 cover-up. They perfected the art of making the unbelievable tragedy vanish into thin air. They taught us to prioritize economic recovery over moral reckoning. They called it an accident. Do not believe them. It was murder by ledger sheet, murder by indifference, murder by design. Every time a corner is cut today, every time a regulation is mocked or defunded, the Sultana's engine roars again beneath the surface of the Mississippi. It teaches the absolute worst lesson. Power is guaranteed forgiveness. Money guarantees silence. And that silence, that profitable, crushing absence of accountability, is the true and unending tragedy that haunts this nation. They didn't just burn the ship's log. They burned a piece of the American conscience. We are still paying the spiritual interest on that scorched earth, that purposeful act of societal gaslighting. It wasn't just bodies that went missing in the Mississippi's dark current. Something fundamental in our collective expectation of justice dissolved right there. We learned to accept the unacceptable. We learned that the price of doing business is occasionally 800 lives, and that this loss will be categorized not as tragedy, but as a regrettable operational expense. It is a cold, calculated transaction. This is the psychological tax we inherited. What is the real hidden cost of knowing this history? It's cynicism, certainly, but it's deeper than mere suspicion. It's the utter erosion of trust in the visible world. You see the polished CEO, the glossy annual report, the government regulator, but you know, deep down in your marrow, it's all a carefully constructed lie. A cheap veneer over a decaying hull. You walk around today, waiting for the inevitable failure, not surprised by it. You expect the corner to be cut. You anticipate the betrayal. This isn't paranoia you feel when you board a plane or buy a prescription drug. This is informed pessimism. This is the crushing awareness that the powerful successfully normalized the absurd idea that certain people are simply immune to consequence, that their ambition creates a force field around their accountability. That is the genius of the cover-up. It makes the soul tired. It makes righteous anger seem pointless. It teaches you to fold. Now look at yourself. You live in a state of perpetual, low-grade fear, because the system designed to protect you has already proven it values efficiency over existence. The trauma of the Sultana didn't just affect the families of the dead. It imprinted on the national subconscious. We learned early that the highest forms of neglect are rewarded with the deepest forms of silence. The Sultana disaster was never truly solved, because the solution wasn't about finding a single overworked engineer to blame. The solution required dismantling the entire architecture of power. that enabled corporate psychopathy to operate anonymously. And that we simply refused to do. The final damning verdict is this: we are not victims of isolated accidents. We are participants in an inherited delusion. We keep showing up for the sequel decade after decade. The Deepwater Horizon, the Boeing 737 MAX, the opioid crisis, hoping this time the ending will be different. It won't be. The script is carved into stone, paid for in blood, and filed away under avoidable fluke. Go look at the Mississippi River today. It looks calm, peaceful, but listen close. Beneath the surface, the steam is still building. The rivets are groaning under pressure, and the most dangerous man in the world isn't the one who commits a crime in the alleyway. It's the one wearing a clean suit, holding a ledger, ready to call your demise an unavoidable cost of progress. That is the true and unrelenting ghost of the Sultana, that quiet, profound realization that the monster you fear is institutional, structural, and standing right outside your door, demanding to be paid. The monster is institutional, structural, and standing right outside your door, demanding to be paid. That debt isn't measured in dollars. It is the hidden tax levied directly upon your soul. The final cruelty of the Sultana's ghost is that it taught us not just how easily we can be extinguished, but how thoroughly we can be convinced that the effort to demand justice is more exhausting than simply absorbing the pain. You feel it now. That quiet surrender in the face of overwhelming corporate malpractice. That's the interest compounding on the Sultana's original principle. We have internalized the lesson that the most effective way to manage a disaster is to manage the narrative until the public collapses from exhaustion. This is the essence of modern governance. Exhaustion is the ultimate instrument of control. They don't need to defeat your anger. They just need to outlast it. They wait until your righteous fury turns into low-grade anxiety, until you decide that filing the complaint, attending the meeting, or reading the exposé is just too much effort for too little reward. They rely on the sheer spiritual fatigue. It's strategic apathy. That is the architecture of the cover-up, perfected over 159 years. And you, staring at this screen, you are paying the psychological tariff. Maybe you think this is melodrama. You are wrong. This isn't history, it's prophecy. Every structural failure, every regulatory capture, every politician who signs a loophole into existence, they are all descendants of the men who packed too many soldiers onto that shoddy boat. They are repeating the ritual. The names change: Sultana, Challenger, Chernobyl, Fukushima. But the script is identical. Cut corners, ignore warnings, maximize profit, and then, when the inevitable explosion happens, spend tenfold on the PR machine, designed to scatter the truth. They bury the truth under so much bureaucratic silt that you start doubting your own memory of the disaster. Did it even happen? Yes, it absolutely did. The most profound realization, the single thing that will either free you or crush you, is that the system is not broken. It is working exactly as intended. The system was never designed to achieve perfect safety. It was designed to achieve optimal profit while maintaining plausible deniability. Safety is an expense. Death, statistically speaking, is a rounding error. That is the cold equations you must accept before you can fight it. Don't tell me it's progress. It's theft. It is the theft of agency, the theft of peace, and the theft of your inherent belief that the rules are uniform. They are not. The men who caused the Sultana disaster were the architects of impunity, and we have been living in the cities they designed ever since. The final verdict, then, is this. The Sultana disaster was not an aberration in American history. It was the founding contract. It formalized the arrangement where the lives of the working class and the marginalized are considered consumables in the engine of industry. We keep looking for external enemies, terrorists, rival nations, digital phantoms, when the true corrosive threat is the quiet man in the mahogany office who has calculated the value of your life and deemed it less than the cost of one quality steel rivet. We are not cursed by bad luck. We are cursed by an inherited willingness to accept the lie that power equals innocence. Stop waiting for accountability. It is not coming. It has never come. The only way to break the fever is to understand that the steam is still building, that the pressure is still rising, and that your fatigue is precisely what they are banking on. The groaning you hear is not the past finally settling. It is the present warning you that the hull is about to give way. The real question is whether you will be standing upright when the final reckoning arrives, or if you will have already folded into the collective, exhausted silence. Choose